This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans, it's time for another episode of Wrestling's Greatest Moments. Wrestling's Greatest Moments has covered many of our favorite enhancement talents, many of whom excelled at their jobs, no pun intended, but never rose up the ranks, or when they did, not for long. However, what about wrestlers who were stars in other promotions, but suddenly became jobbers in the WWF? Sit back as Wrestling's Greatest Moments looks at 10 wrestlers who went from hero to zero in the WWF. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. Whether you call them jobbers, preliminary wrestlers, or enhancement talent, these wrestlers weren't in it to win it, but to make their opponents look like $1 million and give wrestling fans an idea of what an opponent could do in the ring. As discussed in past videos, jobbers came from various backgrounds. Some were former greats who lost a step with age. Others were up-and-coming performers looking to make a name for themselves. Others were capable wrestlers who lacked the look, opportunity, or X factor that made their colleagues into stars. Whatever the case, these wrestlers served a vital role in wrestling, and their contribution should never be ignored or understated. Today's video is something slightly different, as these wrestlers were stars outside the WWF before they suddenly took a tumble. We'll look at some reasons why after we profile 10 heroes who became zeros. Rip Oliver. Rip Oliver is best known to fans of Don Owen's Pacific Northwest Territory, where he played a main event heel for many years, winning the area's Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship 12 times and the Pacific Northwest Tag Team Championship 16 times. Oliver also had a memorable run in World Class Championship Wrestling in 1985, where he lived up to his crippler nickname by kayfabe breaking Mike Von Erich's arm. Oliver worked in the WWF in 1987 and 1988, putting over the majority of his opponents. Oliver joined the ranks of enhancement talents who donned a mask to change things up when he transformed into the Super Ninja, battling the Ultimate Warrior on the November 26, 1988 episode of Saturday Night's Main Event. Despite his transformation, he was no more successful as the Super Ninja than as Rip Oliver. Don Koto. Don Koto exemplified the journeyman wrestler who caught a big break and ran with it. Koto worked many years putting talent over in Jim Crockett Promotions, aka Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, but in 1982, his career took a star turn when he joined fellow enhancement talent Jim Nelson, who would later play Boris Zukov, as Sergeant Slaughter's henchman, Private Nelson and Private Koto. Eventually, Koto was paired with Slaughter in a tag team, and even better, the two captured Jim Crockett Promotions' version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship in a kayfabe tournament. Koto, always a tough competitor, he'd parlayed his amateur wrestling skills into a chance to train as a pro when he nearly went 10 minutes with pro wrestler Bob Roop in an open challenge, was now portrayed as a wrestler who was not one to be trifled with. However, when Koto jumped to the WWF in early 1983, he began putting opponents over night after night. Nothing changed with Koto's talents, but the WWF opted to have him count the lights. The man, nicknamed the Pride of the Carolinas, returned to the Mid-Atlantic area and would go on to hold the NWA World Tag Team Championship 2 more times, and the NWA World Six-Man Tag Team Championship once. Black Bart. A former world champion counting the lights in the WWF? Say what? Actually, Black Bart was the world champion in the World Class Wrestling Association, and as we saw in our video on Phantom title switches, he was more of a transitional champion. Nonetheless, Bart was no Johnny-come-lately, and he had a distinguished run outside the WWF, with championship gold in promotions such as Jim Crockett Promotions, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and the Continental Wrestling Association. Black Bart's 1990 to 1991 run in the WWF was to help break in newcomers, putting them over while also putting over established names. Like many of his colleagues on this list, he won over lower-tier jobbers, but that was the exception to his run in the WWF. Perez. Another Phantom title winner from World Class who worked in the WWF is Perez. Perez who worked in World Class as the Latin heartthrob, seemed like someone who could easily fit into the WWF's mid-card ranks or perhaps even higher. Perez had a good physique, impressive skills, and the looks to catch female fans' attention or project himself as an arrogant man like Rick Rude. Instead, Perez enjoyed a brief run over top-tier enhancement talents such as George South and Barry Horowitz, but before long, El Perez found himself in a different role than he'd had before: enhancement talent. According to the Pro Wrestling Stories article, El Perez, a wrestling career that could have been more, Perez wasn't willing to go with management's suggestions. When management suggested that he shave his head and upgrade his black and white attire for something more colorful, El resisted. In his mind, he had quickly risen to the top of the card everywhere he had wrestled, without a gimmick. Why should the WWF be any different? Another alleged incident may have spelled doom for Perez in the WWF. According to the article just mentioned, Perez met with WWF official Pat Patterson, who talked about how Perez could go both ways. Patterson claims he was referring to Perez's ability to work well as a babyface or a heel, but Perez took Patterson's comments as a remark on his orientation. Perez stood up and kicked the table Patterson was sitting at, kicking his fledgling WWF career to the curb. El Perez later worked in World Championship Wrestling, donning a mask as Sting's mysterious nemesis, the Black Scorpion. Perez was one of several wrestlers who played the Black Scorpion, before the Mystery Man was ultimately revealed as Sting's longtime rival, Ric Flair. Scott Casey. A common element in wrestlers who went from heroes to zeros in the WWF is that they enjoyed success in territories, usually including several runs as a regional champion. Scott Casey, who began wrestling around 1972, is a good example. Casey was a champion in Western States Sports, Central States Wrestling, and even held Southwest Championship Wrestling's World Heavyweight Championship. The world title was part of Southwest's attempt to expand beyond the territory, and Casey's win was a sign of how the promotion viewed his talents. A subsequent campaign in World Class Championship Wrestling saw Casey featured in notable programs, including a feud against the Midnight Express, and later, the Great Kabuki. However, Casey's days as a star were over when he entered the WWF, defeating some enhancement talents, but finding himself putting over marquee players. Tony Anthony. Tony Anthony was a veteran grappler with many titles to his credit in Southern Territories. His dirty white boy gimmick served him well in Memphis, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and Southeastern Championship Wrestling. But his new gimmick in the WWF, not so much. Anthony hopped to the WWF in 1996, with the promotion reaching into its box of gimmicks and turning him into T.L. Hopper, a plumber who decided to take a plunge into the wrestling world. Hopper even brought a plunger to the ring with him and placed it on fallen opponents' faces after the match. This was a rare occasion, though, as Hopper's career quickly sank into the toilet. Tracy Smothers. Tracy Smothers was a fixture in Southern wrestling promotions whose good looks, athletic build, speed, and wrestling skills always kept him in demand. Although he won several singles titles and territories, he seemed to find his mark when he teamed with Steve Armstrong, forming the tag team, the Southern Boys. The Southern Boys won tag team titles, including WCW's United States Tag Team Championship. In 1996, Smothers went to the WWF, where he transformed into Freddie Joe Floyd, a character named after brothers Jack and Jerry Briscoe. Wrestling legend has it that the Freddie Joe Floyd name was a rib based off wrestler Jack Briscoe's first name, while Floyd was Jerry Briscoe's first name. Judging from how Floyd fared in the WWF, Vince McMahon exhausted his creativity once he named Freddie Joe, and the talented Tracy became yet another enhancement talent. Thankfully, Smothers would bounce back when he joined Extreme Championship Wrestling, becoming a member of the Full-Blooded Italians and winning the ECW World Tag Team Championship with Little Guido. Pez Watley. With a career dating back to 1975, Pez Watley was a familiar face in several territories, including Angelo Poffo's International Championship Wrestling, Continental Wrestling Association, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Jim Crockett Promotions. Watley held several regional titles and worked several different gimmicks, including his team with Tiger Conway Jr. as the Jive Tones and Willie B. Hurt in Southeast Championship Wrestling. Watley had a wild run in Jim Crockett Promotions, where he betrayed tag team partner Jimmy Valiant, turning heel and transforming into Shaska Watley, a member of manager Paul Jones' army. Despite his skills and charisma, Watley was utilized as an enhancement talent in the WWF, albeit as a jobber to the stars. Watley had much to offer in making opponents look good, and he later filled the same role in WCW. In addition, he became a trainer at WCW's Power Plant facility. Steve Regal. As longtime fans know, the man nicknamed Mr. Electricity shouldn't be confused with WCW wrestler Lord Steven Regal, later renamed William Regal in the WWF, because apparently Vince McMahon felt the fans would confuse Steven Regal with Steve Austin. Steve Regal often excelled in the junior heavyweight division, holding the American Wrestling Association World Light Heavyweight Championship, and later the National Wrestling Alliance World Junior Heavyweight Championship. Regal worked in territories where his skills made up for a lack of size, and he held many regional titles. He also held the AWA World Tag Team Championship alongside gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, after defeating the Road Warriors, albeit with plenty of help from the Fabulous Freebirds. Unfortunately, Regal's smaller frame meant his championship days were over when he hit the WWF. He could always be counted on to work entertaining matches and make opponents look spectacular. However, in a promotion built for big men, Regal had little chance of going far in the WWF. Bill Irwin. Scott Irwin helped train his brother Bill, and the two would have successful runs in various promotions' tag team divisions. The two wore masks as one of the various incarnations of the Super Destroyers, and later unmasked to work as the Long Riders. Sadly, Scott passed away from a brain tumor in 1987. Bill continued wrestling, forming a team with Black Bart and Global Wrestling Federation. In 1996, Irwin entered the WWF as the Goon. Irwin's WWF gimmick was a hockey player turned wrestler who had been expelled from Hockey League after Hockey League. No truth to the rumor he played for the Halifax Highlanders. The gimmick was as successful as Fox Sports' decision to feature a glowing hockey puck for TV games, and Irwin was sent off the ice for good less than a year later. Why did these wrestlers become enhancement talents in the WWF? There are several reasons why these wrestlers became enhancement talents in the WWF. As we saw with Al Perez, there were likely factors specific to him that 8-balled any chance of a push. However, what about the other talents? For many wrestlers, it was a case of wrestlers being a big fish in a small pond before they entered the big pond of the WWF. Wrestlers who were stars, ranging from mid-card and up in other territories, found themselves in a company with an all-star roster, especially in the 80s and early 90s when Vince McMahon assembled the best wrestlers from outside the WWF. There was also the size factor. Several of these wrestlers lacked the height and physique that Vince McMahon sought in his top stars. In some cases, Vince McMahon was happy to poach talent from other territories just to hurt these territories by damaging their rosters. McMahon had no intention of using these wrestlers in major roles, but if taking them away from other promotions hurt these promotions, it was reason enough to sign them. That's not to say that McMahon felt these wrestlers were disposable. As we've seen in other videos profiling enhancement talent, the WWF recognized the value of seasoned workers who can make opponents look terrific, and all the wrestlers mentioned on our list fit the bill. Finally, several of the wrestlers on our list were brought into the WWF around 1995 to 1996 for a specific reason: to round out its undercard with seasoned workers put over the new generation. For example, wrestlers including Tony Anthony, Bill Irwin, and Tracy Smothers had the in-ring skills for good matches, but for whatever reason weren't seen as deserving of a push. Instead, they received personas reminiscent of other jobbers to the stars such as the Brooklyn Brawler, with wins being rare. It didn't help that the WWF was at one of its lowest points creatively, and wrestlers were saddled with gimmicks that would have sunk any career, even with a push. Do you remember these wrestlers who were big in one promotion, only to suddenly become enhancement talent? Do you think the WWF did them wrong? Don't worry if we didn't mention your favorites, so we'll have another video down the line if there's enough interest. Share your thoughts in the comment section, and let us know if there's any videos you'd like Wrestling's Greatest Moments to cover. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel, follow us on X and Instagram, and spread the good news about Wrestling's Greatest Moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.